right, that the Treaty of Versailles was harsh on Germany, right? It restricted it basically kept them from having any military forces at all. It restricted their economic position. It demanded financial reparations from them that kind of really harmed their economy. So a lot of times people will say that in some ways the First World War caused the second, right? Or that it was one big long war. I actually I don't know if I believe that, right? Because for two reasons. One, the Second World War started in Asia, not in Europe, right? It starts between China and Japan in 1937, right? And so I think that leaves that part out. And then also, I think people had a chance in the 1930s to stop World War II, to stop Hitler, and they didn't. And I think saying, it was destined to happen because of choices made in the 1910s, I think lets those people off the hook a little bit too much.
What was the UN created before the Second World War? Or
no, the Treaty of Versailles creates the League of Nations, which is like the first attempt at that, right? The United States never joins it, and it doesn't have nearly the power that the United Nations does. The UN is created in 1945 and the U.S. is really in the lead in forming it, and in part trying to ensure that whatever comes out of World War II is going to be more effective than the League of Nations that had come out of World War I.
Because at the beginning of World War II, before that, Germany increases power and they start taking over, expanding to different countries, and the Allies really didn't interfere with that in the beginning. Why is that?
Germany in part just starts breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, right? It occupies territory that it had been excluded from. It
builds a military,
builds a military, all these things. And each one was a step that most of the other European powers, and including the United States too, felt that it was not enough to risk a war. Right? And in part that is a calculated step-by-step project of the Nazis. In part, it's also the domestic pressures that each of those countries are facing at home in terms of, they have domestic populations that don't want to go to war again. They've just lived through a war, right, with Germany. And so, they're, in hindsight, we call it appeasement, right? And we say they should have, they should have stopped Hitler sooner. There were political constraints, military constraints that kept them at each moment from doing that.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. I didn't really understand it at first.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth remembering, right, that most Americans and also most British, most French people, if you asked them in the 1930s, they would have said World War I was a terrible mistake. We never should have done it. And so if all your voters think that, it's going to be hard to convince them to challenge Germany again, right? To challenge, when they make a small step here and a small step there. And the Nazis understood that and pushed whenever they could.
Yeah, and when World War II began, the U.S. was hesitant in really joining the war because of what happened in World War II or World War I. But Pearl Harbor occurred, and that really brought them into the war. Correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And so, really from September 1939, and when Germany invades Poland, until December 7th, 1941, the United States is not officially at war, although it's also not neutral, right? The U.S., it's not like World War I. The U.S. is really actively trying to support Britain and France, and particularly Britain after, once the Blitz comes and they're really fighting alone. And Britain is bankrupt. Britain needs weapons. The U.S. is really kind of propping them up. but it is only the attack of Pearl Harbor that brings the U.S. officially into war on both fronts.
Mm-hmm. And World War II is fought differently than previous wars because of the introduction of a lot of new technology like tanks and airplanes. What led to that kind of advancement in the war, like during that time?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, a lot of those military technologies had been there during the First World War, right? Tanks and planes, for example. But the scale of them, their abilities, and just even the sheer number of them increases by World War II, right? And on the aerial front, for example, the breakdown of norms that would have made sort of bombing civilians, unjust, right, or immoral, and that breaks down on both sides, right? And so you start to see the large scale bombing of civilian populations, right? Which is in part what then makes it possible for the use of atomic weapons at the end of the war.
Yeah.
Right? But a lot of these technologies are created because the warring powers pour enormous amounts of money and time and expertise into them, right? They don't just come out of nowhere. For sure.